Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me. My name is Frank Holloway. I'm 52 years old, and if you'd told me that one ordinary workday would destroy my marriage and completely rewrite my future, I would have laughed. Looking back now, the moment that stayed with me wasn't even the divorce papers. It was a vending machine that swallowed $4 and gave me nothing. Somehow, that tiny frustration captured exactly what my life had become. I'd just finished another exhausting shift at the warehouse where I'd worked for over a decade. My back hurt, my boots were soaked, and all I wanted was a sandwich before heading home. I stood staring at the blinking error code on the vending machine, debating whether I had enough energy left to complain, when I heard expensive heels clicking across the break room floor. I turned around. My wife, Sandra, stood there wearing clothes I'd never seen before. She looked polished, confident, like she'd been preparing for this moment. In her hand was a thick envelope. She wasn't alone. Standing behind her, leaning casually against the doorway, was my operations manager, Craig Denton. Greg had spent the last 3 years making my work life miserable. He took credit for my ideas, excluded me from important meetings, and treated me with that quiet arrogance only certain managers seem to master. Seeing him standing behind my wife told me everything before either of them said a word. Sandra slid the envelope toward me. "We need to do this today." I opened it. Divorce papers. Not fresh ones either. They'd been prepared 2 weeks earlier. She'd been carrying them around, waiting for the perfect moment to embarrass me. The break room fell silent. My co-workers suddenly became fascinated by their phones. My friend Pete couldn't even look at me. I asked quietly, "You're really doing this here?" She folded her arms. "I needed to know you'd actually receive them." I looked from her to Craig. "You're leaving me for him." She didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "I'm leaving because I'm tired of waiting for a better life." That sentence hurt more than the papers themselves. For years, I'd worked overtime to keep us afloat. Every extra shift was supposed to build the future we talked about. Vacations could wait. Bigger dreams could wait. Bills couldn't. Apparently, she'd grown tired of waiting. Craig never said a word. He didn't have to. The smile on his face said enough. I looked down at the papers, picked up the pen lying on the table, and signed every page. Sandra blinked. That wasn't the reaction she'd expected. She'd prepared herself for shouting, begging, maybe even anger. Instead, I slid the papers back across the table. "I hope this gives you what you're looking for." Without another word, I grabbed my bag, pressed the vending machine's coin return one last time. Still, no $4, and walked out. Outside, I sat alone in my truck for nearly 15 minutes. Sometimes your heart knows the truth long before your mind accepts it. Driving home felt different. The house we'd shared for 16 years already felt abandoned. Her closet was mostly empty. Her bathroom shelf had been cleared except for an old bottle of lotion and a forgotten black hair tie. Strange how the smallest things become the hardest to look at. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and began opening the pile of mail I'd ignored for weeks. Bills, credit card statements, utility notices. Then one envelope caught my attention. Heavy cream-colored paper. My full legal name was printed across the front. Frank Raymond Holloway. Almost nobody called me Raymond anymore. The return address belonged to a downtown law firm. At first I assumed it was another debt or legal notice. I nearly tossed it aside. Instead I opened it. Inside was a short letter requesting that I contact attorney Gerald Marsh regarding the estate of Raymond Dale Holloway, my uncle, a man I'd met only once, at my mother's funeral 22 years earlier. I still remembered that day. He'd shaken my hand, slipped me an envelope containing $5,000, told me to use it wisely, and disappeared from my life without another word. Now he was gone, and somehow he had remembered me. I barely slept that night. Questions kept circling through my mind. Why me? Why now? The next morning, I called the attorney's office. Gerald Marsh answered personally and asked if I could come in immediately. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting in one of the nicest offices I'd ever seen. Everything about the place spoke of money, stability, and decisions made by people who never worried about missing rent. Gerald stood to greet me, shook my hand warmly, and invited me to sit. Then he got straight to the point. Your uncle passed away 3 weeks ago. I nodded quietly. I barely knew him. Gerald slid a thick folder across the table. He knew enough about you. Inside were financial statements, investment summaries, and legal documents filled with numbers so large they barely seemed real. Then Gerald calmly said something that made the room feel perfectly still. At the time of his death, your uncle's estate was valued at approximately $470 million. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. He looked me directly in the eyes. You are his sole heir. Just yesterday, I'd been wondering whether I could afford lunch at work. 24 hours later, someone was telling me I had inherited more money than I could ever spend. I took a slow breath. Walk me through everything. Gerald nodded and opened another folder. There is one asset you'll probably recognize. He turned a page toward me. At the top was a familiar name, Howick Group Holdings, the parent company that owned the warehouse where I'd spent the last 11 years working. I frowned. I know that company. Gerald gave a small nod. You should. He looked at me calmly before delivering the sentence that changed everything. You now own 63% of it. My heart didn't race. I didn't celebrate. I simply sat there thinking about one image. Craig Denton, standing in that break room beside my wife, smiling as though he'd already won. Neither of them had the slightest idea what had just happened. I closed the folder slowly. Gerald, I said, I'm going to need 90 days. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded. Because sometimes the strongest move isn't made in anger. Sometimes it's made after you're patient enough to see the whole board. I left Gerald's office with 2 folders under my arm and more questions than answers. The money itself still didn't feel real. What stayed with me was something far more personal. Why would a man I barely knew spend years making sure everything he built would one day become mine? That night I sat alone in the quiet house, thinking about my uncle instead of Sandra. He had watched my life from a distance somehow. He must have seen something in me that I had never seen in myself. The following morning, I went back to work. Pete met me near the lockers. You didn't have to come in, he said carefully. I smiled faintly. I've still got a job to do. Craig acted as though nothing had happened. He walked past me, gave my shoulder a light pat, and offered one of those fake, sympathetic smiles that managers use when they think they've already won. I returned the same calm nod I'd always given him. Only this time I knew something he didn't. After my shift ended, I called Gerald. I need a complete audit, I told him. Everything. The financial records, the vendor contracts, safety reports, human resources. I want every decision from the last several years reviewed. There was a brief silence before Gerald answered. That's a very large investigation. I know. Can it be done quietly? It can. Good, I replied. Start immediately. That evening, I drove home feeling strangely peaceful for the first time in months. Sandra believed she'd walked away from a tired warehouse supervisor. Craig believed he'd humiliated an employee who could never fight back. Neither of them realized they had just underestimated the man who now owned the company they depended on. I wasn't interested in revenge. Not yet. First I wanted the truth, and I was willing to wait as long as it took to find it. The audit began without anyone inside Howick Distribution realizing it. From Craig's point of view, business continued as usual. He still walked the warehouse floor with the same confidence, still dismissed concerns with polished excuses, and still believed nobody above him was paying attention. From my point of view, every evening looked different. I'd sit alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of reports, contracts, emails, and financial records. The quiet house had become my office. Night after night, I read every page Gerald's team uncovered. None of what we found surprised me. It only confirmed what I'd been seeing for years. Vendor contracts had been awarded to companies connected, to people close to Craig. Safety. Inspections had been altered just enough to avoid raising questions. Workplace injuries had been delayed or quietly minimized. Employee complaints had been buried. Executive bonuses kept growing, while basic requests from warehouse workers were rejected for budget reasons. One report stopped me cold. Pete's request for replacement safety harnesses. He had submitted the same request every year for 3 straight years. Denied, denied again, denied a third time. The cost had been called unnecessary. Only 11 days later, Greg approved a substantial increase to his own executive compensation. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. That wasn't poor management. That was a choice. Weeks passed, and the evidence continued to grow. Gerald never exaggerated the facts. He simply organized them until they spoke for themselves. About a month after Sandra left, my phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen. I let it ring a few times before answering. "Frank." Her voice sounded careful. "I just wanted to check on you." "I'm doing fine." There was a pause. "You sound different."
Do I?
"You seem calmer." I looked around the quiet kitchen. "I've had time to think." She hesitated. "I know everything happened quickly." I didn't argue. I didn't remind her that she'd served me divorce papers in front of my co-workers while standing beside another man. Some things no longer needed repeating. Instead, I asked, "How are you?" She seemed surprised that I'd even asked. "I'm good. I'm glad." Another silence. She finally mentioned the house and said her attorney would be contacting mine. "That's fine," I replied. I wished her well, ended the call, and returned to the audit documents without another thought. By the 7th week, Gerald called me downtown. The investigation was complete. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing every finding. There were documented financial irregularities, conflict of interest contracts, suppressed HR complaints, safety violations, sworn statements from current and former employees. Everything was supported by evidence. When Gerald finished, he folded his hands. "Civil liability is significant," he said. "There may also be criminal exposure depending on how regulators proceed." I nodded slowly. "And Craig?" "As far as he knows," Gerald replied, "nothing has changed. He believes the upcoming board meeting is just another routine quarterly review." "Good." I closed the folder. "Let's keep it that way." I instructed Gerald to schedule the meeting as an ownership transition and strategic review using completely ordinary language. No surprises, no warnings. I wanted everyone to walk into that room believing it would be another predictable corporate meeting. Before leaving, I remembered something else. "What about the warehouse safety harnesses?" Gerald looked at me. "They've waited long enough." "I want the purchase approved immediately. If company procedures delay it, use estate funds. No employee should risk getting hurt because an executive wanted a larger bonus." He wrote down the instruction without comment. That evening I drove to Pete's house. He answered the door wearing an old Bengal sweatshirt, clearly surprised to see me. Inside, his wife brought us coffee before quietly giving us privacy. I told Pete enough for him to understand what was happening. Not every financial detail, not the size of the inheritance, just the truth that mattered. The parent company now belongs to me. He stared at me for several seconds. "You're serious?" "I am." "And Craig?" "He has no idea." Pete slowly smiled. Then I told him something else. "Those safety harnesses you've been requesting, they've already been ordered." For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he shook his head. 3 years, he whispered. "I know." He looked at me carefully. "You're not planning to explode in that boardroom, are you?" I smiled. "No." Pete nodded. "Good. Men like Craig know how to fight loud people. They never know what to do with someone who's quiet." Driving home that night, I realized Pete was right. Anger would have given Craig something to defend against. Patience had given me something far more dangerous. The truth. When I reached home, I pressed my gray suit, the only good suit I owned. It had been hanging untouched in my closet for years. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be walking into that building as a warehouse supervisor. I'd be walking in as the man who owned it, and no one inside that boardroom knew it yet. The morning of the board meeting arrived with cold November rain. I stood in front of the mirror, wearing the same gray suit I'd only worn a handful of times over the years. Looking back at me wasn't a different man. It was the same warehouse supervisor. The only difference was that now I knew exactly who I was. I drove downtown, walked through the rain without an umbrella, and entered Harwick Group Holdings. Security checked my name, looked at the meeting list twice, then quietly directed me to the 18th floor. When I stepped into the boardroom, I noticed Craig before he noticed me. He was laughing with another executive, completely relaxed. To him, this was just another quarterly meeting. Then he looked up. His smile disappeared. First came confusion, then recognition. Then the question written across his face. Why was I there? Before he could speak, Gerald Marsh entered behind me and closed the door. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, please allow me to introduce Frank Raymond Holloway, sole heir to the Raymond Holloway, estate and majority, shareholder of Harwick Group Holdings. He paused. Effective today, your new chairman. The room fell completely silent. Craig pushed his chair back. That's impossible, he said. He works for me. I met his eyes calmly. I used to. Then I walked to the head of the table and took my seat. No dramatic speech, no celebration, just business. I opened the audit file. Over the last 90 days, I said, a complete independent review has been conducted across Harwick Distribution. The first presentation covered vendor contracts. The second detailed safety violations. The third revealed hidden HR settlements, financial manipulation, and conflicts of interest. Every accusation was backed by documents. Every number had proof. Craig interrupted more than once. These reports don't show the full picture. You don't understand how operations work. I never raised my voice. I understand enough to know you approved your own bonus. Shortly after denying safety equipment for warehouse employees. I clicked to the next slide. Pete Akers requested replacement safety harnesses 3 consecutive years. You rejected every request. The room stayed silent. Board members who had arrived, expecting a routine meeting, were now reading evidence that could not be explained away. Finally, I closed the folder. Craig Denton. I looked directly at him. Your employment with Harwick Group Holdings is terminated immediately for cause. Your access to company property is revoked. This matter will also be referred to legal counsel for potential civil and criminal action. Greg stood so quickly his chair slammed into the wall. This is revenge. It's about your wife. I held his gaze without anger. No, this is accountability. You simply never expected someone to hold you responsible. Security entered quietly. Craig looked around the room, searching for support. Nobody moved. Nobody defended him. A few moments later, he walked out alone. The board officially approved the ownership, transition, and authorized a complete review of every company division. When the meeting ended, I left the building feeling lighter, not victorious, just finished. About an hour later, my phone rang. Sandra, I answered. What did you do? She asked. Craig said security escorted him out. I did my job. There was a long silence. Then she asked quietly, You own the company? The parent company. Since when? 3 months. Another silence. You could have warned us. Us. Even then, she still spoke as though Craig's future was somehow my responsibility. I owed the employees honesty, I said. I owed the company integrity. I didn't owe either of you anything beyond the law. She had no answer. The call ended. Over the following weeks, consequences arrived one by one. Former employees came forward. Legal claims increased. Craig's professional reputation collapsed. The influence he'd spent years building disappeared almost overnight. Power based on position rarely survives after the position is gone. One afternoon, Pete sent me a photograph. 14 brand new orange safety harnesses stacked neatly inside the warehouse equipment room. Nothing extraordinary. Just workers finally receiving the equipment they should have had years earlier. Oddly enough, that picture meant more to me than any bank statement ever could. Several weeks later, Sandra called one last time. Her voice sounded tired. I made a mistake. I looked across my quiet front porch before answering. No, you made a choice. What happened afterward was simply the consequence of that choice. She never argued. She simply hung up. Life became ordinary again. The divorce was finalized. The company moved forward. Employees who had spent years feeling invisible finally had leadership, willing to listen. Looking back, I often think about that vending machine, the one that stole my $4. At the time, it felt like the perfect symbol of a life that kept taking more than it gave. I understand now that I was wrong. The divorce didn't destroy me. The humiliation didn't define me. Neither did Craig. The real change happened the moment I refused to answer betrayal with anger. Patience isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. Real strength is knowing when to wait, when to prepare, and when to step forward, only after the truth is already standing beside you. Sandra believed she was leaving behind an ordinary warehouse worker. Craig believed he had already won. Neither of them realized they were walking away from the man who would soon own the very company they thought gave them power. By the time they finally understood the truth, I was already sitting at the head of the table, quietly building a future that no longer depended on either of them.